Professor. Jessica, remind us what exactly the accusations were. We touched on them a moment ago. But in this case, Letitia James's office essentially made accusations that NRA leadership, including, as we said, the former CEO Wayne LaPierre, spent millions of dollars. What else did we learn over the course of this trial?
Well, it's the idea that he spent millions of dollars, but not for the benefit of the NRA, as you said, for his benefit, that there were a bunch of really big expenses like private planes and lavish trips to far off places like the Bahamas, and also contracts awarded to people who gave gifts to him. And that all of that was done not for the benefit of the NRA, but for his own benefit. There were also accusations here and a finding of liability based on the idea that he abused his position as head of this nonprofit, that he did not exercise good faith, and that he breached something called his fiduciary duty. What's interesting is that when this case first began, Letitia James had actually asked for the NRA to be dissolved, which is obviously the nuclear option when it comes to a nonprofit. The judge said, no, we don't think there's enough there for corporate death, so to speak. But what we do have here is a big win for Letitia James on the charges that were left.
And remind us of what LaPierre's defense was. I know in the closing arguments, his defense team essentially said when it came to the jets, for instance, that was a necessary expense due to safety concerns.
That's right. And they also said much of what he did was for the benefit of the NRA, that this wasn't for his personal benefit. He did on the stand admit that there were a number of gifts he got that should have been, for instance, disclosed as gifts. So I think part of the reason why the jury maybe didn't buy his story is that it didn't feel consistent, and he did give concessions on the stand. One of the other arguments to the point about, well, he had safety concerns, he needed to have a private jet. The response to that is you need to go through the proper channels in order to spend that money, and then you need to disclose that you spent that money for that purpose. And just to take a step back, let's remember that the NRA, while it has an enormous amount of money, it is a nonprofit, and there are things that the government gives you as a result of being a nonprofit. You have favorable tax treatment, for instance, but you do have to comply in exchange with the government's regulatory system, and you have to disclose information. And part of that is to keep the nonprofit honest. And part of that is so the government can figure out whether or not you truly are functioning as a nonprofit, or if you're functioning as somebody's private bank account, for instance.
And so we know that as part of their task in this case, the jury was also looking at if the organization and its leaders were in fact liable, then what the monetary damages should be. Jessica, explain that for us. We know that there were these millions of dollars outlined over the course of this trial that the prosecutor's office said had been misspent. The jury is also coming up with the monetary damages, essentially restitution for the NRA.
That's right. And that's one of the things that the state prosecutor pointed to in response to allegations that this was just a politically motivated case and that they were only moving forward because they wanted to destroy the NRA, again, for political purposes. What they said is, in fact, if they win, this case will benefit the NRA because the NRA will get money back. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. The jury, and I believe it was 5 of the 6 jurors had to agree on each of these counts. The jury found that Wayne LaPierre had, in fact, improperly benefited to the tune of, I believe, $5.4 million. They said he'd already repaid $1 million, but he owes the organization another about 4.4 million. And so that is making the NRA whole again. That is essentially saying this is what you siphoned off. This is how you improperly benefited, and that's what needs to go back to the organization.
And Jessica, remind us how this case came to be in the first place. The Attorney General said very early on this was something that she essentially campaigned on. He's looking at the NRA, and you talked about this a moment ago. But this is something that back in 2020, the Attorney General's office was already examining.
They were. And what was interesting is that part of the reason that I think this case did end up going to trial and a jury verdict, and now a successful jury verdict, is that there weren't just allegations of misuse of the NRA's funds and failing to disclose and failing to use your leadership duties properly, meaning breaching your fiduciary duty. But there were also allegations here, and I believe the jury found that they did not properly have a whistleblower setup, so to speak, that they didn't have rules about whistleblowers. And in fact, when I think it was Oliver North who was hired and then blew the whistle on the use of finances, was then ousted. I believe he was part of the trigger for why the Attorney General's office did, in fact, start looking into the NRA. Again, the allegations being they didn't have proper rules about whistleblowers. And in fact, they ousted and punished those who tried to say something's going on here with respect to the finances. And of course, for history buffs, Oliver North is a well-known figure, and I believe he was one of the key whistleblowers in this case.
So, Jessica, what happens next here?
So what happens next is that there could, of course, be an appeal of the verdict. Having said that, I think we should all remember that appeals typically are not successful. There's always the possibility that an appellate court could find some grounds to change the jury award, but the jurors are the fact finders here. And when it comes to findings of fact, that is entitled to deference. An appellate court doesn't review that, quote unquote, de novo with fresh eyes, but they give that, again, some deference that they weren't the ones in the courtroom. So I think what happens next is that Wayne LaPierre is going to eventually have to find a way to repay the NRA.
All right. Again, the NRA and its longtime former leader have been found liable in this New York civil lawsuit. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much for your analysis. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are also following a developing story from space. We have learned the lunar lander we tracked yesterday tipped over when it touched down. That's according to the CEO of Intuitive Machines, the private company operating the spacecraft. The company says Odysseus is on its side and leaning on a rock, but it's still running. The company had previously said it landed upright, but that proved to be incorrect. It is the first American spacecraft to land on the moon in more than 50 years. It's also the first time a private